the interim director of the center, and the emerging markets theme at the College of Business. The emerging market theme is a joint initiative between a number of institutes within the College of Business, among them CISR, the Cornell Institute of China Economic Research at Dyson, whose director, Shangjun Lee, is also with us today and is co-director of the theme, and Arnab Basu, and myself, and my name is Lourdes Casanova, and I am a senior lecturer and director of the Emerging Markets Institute. So thank you very much, Rodrigo, for accepting the invitation to this very important occasion, because it's also, you are the keynote address of the LACS February Research Symposium. So Rodrigo does research with colleagues at Cornell, so very happy to find out that you are also working with colleagues like Diane Barton at ILR. And you do research at the intersection of organizational and institutional theory, with a very particular interest on the role of institutions for economic development. He studies how individuals are affected by, and in turn purposefully change complex organizations or systems. His work explores how individuals, backgrounds, professional identities, and organizational positions affect how they relate to the existing structures and the strategies they pursue to change them. And his work contributes to a deeper understanding of the mechanisms that allow institutions to operate and change. He has also done work in entrepreneurial finance and microfinance, as well as the institutional implications of the Mexican war on drugs, and we hear a lot in the press currently and for a while now. And his current research on the topic of the top is funded with generous support from the Merida Initiative, and explores how to build effective, resilient, and trusted police organizations in Mexico. Also, Rodrigo is part of the advisory board of the Dalai Lama Center in Yale that explores also values and ethics in organizations and in individuals, and which is a very important work that he does. And he has an MBA and a PhD from MIT. How we are going to organize today's presentation. So first, Rodrigo will present his research, and then Gustavo, the director of LACS, will handle the Q&A, and we hope around 6 p.m. we'll close the seminar. So thank you very much, Rodrigo. The floor is yours. Before that, Gustavo, you want to add a few words?
Well, thank you, Lourdes. I mean, really, I don't want to take up Rodrigo's airtime, but I am really delighted to welcome him to the, the symposium, really, as a keynote speaker. And this is a tradition for us at Cornell, everybody that does Latin America, but also now jointly with the Emerging Markets Institute, that makes it a special occasion for us. And like I said, when I first joined, very much looking forward to your talk, and I've always followed your work and think very highly of it. So thank you for joining us.
Well, Lourdes, Gustavo, thank you. I really appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate the introduction, of course. So my plan, today's talk, if I'm being fully honest, was a little bit difficult for me to organize, because I was trying to balance how academic for the presentation to be versus how to also appeal to the broader audience who's kind of more concerned about policy issues and just more general themes. And so I hope that I don't end up with one of those situations where I end up pleasing nobody in trying to kind of balance these things. But what I was thinking is that I am going to, even though I have 1.5 million slides, I'm going to try to concentrate my talk for about 45 minutes, just to give you a sense for the main initiatives or main research streams that we've been working on for the past few years on this question of police reform in Latin America, with the hope that I'm not going to take that much time, so that the audience can decide what themes or what aspects you want to go deeper in. And so anything that I present, we can go as deep and as detailed as you want, or as broad and as generic as you want to take it. And so I thought that would be maybe the best way. So I'm going to try to stick to like 45 minutes of presentation, again, understanding that I'm not going to give you that much detail, because you'll see that we have several initiatives to cover. And then we can see where the audience would like to take it. And for anything that I present, I have additional materials in depth that we can go into. And if you could just help me confirm that you can see my slides properly. Excellent. Thank you. And let me see if I can just change the view here so that I can see. Okay, perfect. Great. So as Lourdes was mentioning, the materials that I'm going to present today come from a larger research initiative that I've been leading for the past 4 or 5 years that's been generously funded by the Merida Initiative, which is now changing names for political reasons. But that is kind of a binational between the US and Mexico. It's a binational agreement for technical support. And the broad question of our research for the past few years has been this question of like, how do we go about building effective, resilient, and trusted police organizations in Mexico? But also you'll see that a lot of what we do and what we have found, I think, is applicable to Latin America in general, but even to the US, so to other countries as well. Before I say anything else, I do want to recognize that all the work that I'm going to be talking about is actually the output of an incredibly talented and committed group of individuals. One of whom, by the way, is graduating from her PhD at Cornell imminently. That would be Jessica Sarkin, and she would be on the top row. She's the third from right to left. Who's just an insanely, infinitely talented woman who some of you may know. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about has been done in contribution with her and the rest of the people that you see in this slide, who again are just a young and committed and incredibly talented group of people. And broadly, what we have tried to do is, if I can take a step back before I go into each of these kind of research initiatives. Lourdes, you had mentioned when you talked about my work in organized crime, you said like, oh, it's been on the media. And to be honest, like the conversation about the security issues in Mexico for the past more than a decade has been what I often call like cartelized, meaning the whole conversation is about organized crime and the violence of organized crime and the impact of organized crime. And of course, organized crime is an important symptom of our security problems. But a quick thought experiment leads you to think that actually there's a ton of organized crime in the US as well, right? And there's sophisticated, large, diversified, and certainly well-populated organized crime in the United States and in Canada and in every country on the planet. And yet the behavior of these criminal organizations varies very much from one country to country. And so even though in Mexico, we've been kind of obsessed with organized crime, and I was also guilty of this in some of the research that I did a few years ago, when you notice how differently organized crime behaves across settings, at least for me, it raised the question of like, well, the problem cannot be organized crime. That's not the problem, that's the symptom. The problem is that we have a series of structural weaknesses in our institutions of public safety. And of course, organized crime, being the strategic actor that it is, amplifies, takes advantage of these institutional weaknesses. And so in our work, we decided to take a step kind of back from the general narrative of organized crime as the central problem of safety in Mexico, and instead focus on what we think is the crux of the problem, which is the institutional weakness of the public safety institutions in the country. And with that as kind of a starting point, our approach has been to say, all right, first and foremost, the first and most immediate institution of public safety that needs to be strengthened are local police forces. If we don't have strong local police forces, there's nothing else that we can do. And so let's focus on them. And as we're studying police forces, we should start thinking about them as organizations. Before anything else, police forces are organizations. And so let's study them as organizations. And within that framework, we kind of we set up like 3 big research questions that I'm going to be talking about today. The first big question is a question of organizational design. What should a police organization look like from a structural perspective? What are the processes, structures, systems that a police organization needs to have as a baseline to be able to deliver on its mandate? A second big question that we're asking is, conditional on identifying a set of principles of organizational design for police forces, what is a path to police reform that seems to be more reliable or more likely to succeed, right? And so first question, what should a police organization look like, or what are principles of organizational design? Having answered that, what is a path to reform that seems to be more effective? And third, there are certain practices that have been identified in a variety of settings as being quote unquote evidence-based and best practice. So what does it look like to actually integrate one of these practices into a complex setting in an existing organization like a police force? We know from experience, both in policing and in other settings, that trying to copy paste best practices from one setting to the other usually doesn't work. And so if copy pasting doesn't work, then what does? What does it mean to fully integrate a best practice or an evidence-based practice into an existing complex organization? So those are the three big questions that we've been tackling in our research. And I'm going to kind of show you some of the more prominent and more interesting initiatives that we've been working on. And I'm going to try to walk you through each of them kind of quickly so that, again, you can tell us what you're more interested in regarding questions. And so, you know, these three questions kind of sort themselves into two kind of big research streams. The first is on this kind of organizational design question. How do you go about designing effective, resilient, and trusted police departments? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And the second is on this broader question of like, how do you systematically, as a police organization, how do you engage citizens and systematically build trust with them? And we kind of started that work in Mexico City, but as you will see, we have also expanded to some other places. And so on the first, which again, I think helps us set a conceptual framework for all the work that we do. Our question is like, you know, if you ask mayors in the US or in Mexico, most people don't even want to touch the question of police reform because they see it as a politically losing battle. And because they have other fish to fry. And by the way, they don't know how to tackle it. So we talk to mayors who actually are interested in tackling police reform. A question that they often say is like, I don't know where to start. Like, I have no idea where to even start a process of police reform because there's very little guidance out there on what a police organization should look like. And our approach was to try and inform that question. And so we did kind of a couple of things. That I kept this slide because that's actually Jess Sarkin, your talented PhD, I guess now graduate, who will be leaving you soon for her assistant professorship. So she helped kind of lead all this work. And so the first thing that we did is we conducted 11 in-depth case studies of genuine attempts at police reform, 9 in Mexico, 2 in the United States. And these are kind of 9 places where there was a genuine attempt at police reform. There was a project, it was funded, there was a multi-year approach. And again, it was a genuine attempt at reform. And in some of these places, they succeeded. In some of these places, they achieved some success and they reverted back. And in some of these places, the reform kind of never really took off. And so we have kind of a matched case approach to try and kind of disentangle what are the patterns that we observe in reform processes that are more or less effective. And we matched, or we complemented these 9 Mexican cases with the cases of Stockton and Oakland, which are uniquely interesting in their approach to police reform. And I'm happy to talk about the details about that. But that's one of the things that we did to the kind of some of the data that we collected for this question about organizational design. And then we complemented this with the creation of kind of 2 really large data sets. The first large data set is, to our surprise, there was no systematic data on the characteristics, quality, evolution, size, budget of police forces across Mexico. Like the US, public safety in Mexico is the mandate of municipalities. And so we have thousands of police forces. In the US, you have about 18,000. In Mexico, we have about 2,500. And when we started looking into this, we're like, all right, there must be some data set of all the police forces in the country. There's none. And so the first thing that we did was kind of try to bring together a integrated data set of all the data that exists about police forces. So we integrated more than 25 different sources, you know, private, public, and other types of data to just integrate this data set of just the characteristics, size, budgeting, equipment, just like configuration of the workforce of all the police forces in the country. And so we did that. And we were very proud of that data set. But as we started analyzing it, what we realized is, like, on the one hand, this is really useful because it had never been put together before. But on the other hand, what this data set gave us at best was a description of the shell, what police forces look like from the outside. And so what does the shell of these police organizations look like? Which can be a useful starting point, but because we were most interested in questions of organizational design, those are things that you can only observe when you look into these organizations. And these data didn't give us access to that. And so the next thing that we did, and again, right now, I just want to give you a sense of the data that we collected so that I can set up the baseline for the kinds of results that I'm going to discuss in a minute. So the next thing that we did is we designed an instrument to actually measure the managerial and internal organizational practices of police forces. And we collected kind of we have two moments in time when we collected these data. So this is an instrument that is based on the World Management Survey, which is an instrument that has been validated in the private sector for a number of years. We kind of broke it apart and then put it back together, but designed for policing. And this is an instrument that is designed to measure in a very granular level, the managerial and organizational practices inside of an organization. And so with this instrument that has these kind of 5 big components, so we measured 21 practices across 5 components, which include kind of modern techniques of management and how do police organizations manage their operations? How do they monitor performance and how to evaluate performance? How do they set targets as an organization, and also how do they follow up on those targets? How do they manage their talent? You know, it's like training, continuous development, promotions, sanctions, etc. And then questions of organizational resilience, meaning how does the organization protect itself from external threats at infiltration, intimidation, co-optation, etc. Right? And so we collected these data first in 2018. In 2018, we collected it for 431 municipalities as a random representative sample of police forces that included rural, urban, semi-urban, and state-level police forces. And then we collected a second, as I mentioned, a second wave of these data where we adapted. I don't know what's going on with give me a second. Something is happening with my keyboard went completely berserk. Sorry about that. Okay, so here we were. So, you know, the 2018 data were amazing, and I'll show you some of the things that we saw. But then for 2020, when we did the second wave, we added an extra component to the instrument that helps us measure also any organizational practices that the police forces have set in place to engage in citizen outreach and to systematically build trust with citizens. And so we also have a set of practices that we measure on kind of community policing or problem-oriented policing or just any kind of citizen outreach initiative. So now you have an idea of all the data that we collected to come up, just to analyze this question of, like, you know, A, what should police organizations look like? And B, what's a better path to police reform? And, you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about the World Management Survey data. Kind of one of the things, what I like about this graph, or I'm trying to convey to this graph with this graph to you, is 2 things. Number one, we found just enormous variance in managerial quality. And so what you have on the y-axis here is the aggregate score that police forces got on their management quality, which is, you know, we aggregate all these practices and we have ways of scoring them, and we create different scores. This is just the average final aggregate score of all the managerial practices of police force so that we can kind of compare across. So one thing that we found is that there's just enormous variance in managerial quality across police departments, which, you know, I'm sure you're not surprised when I say it, but looking at the data was quite surprising to see just how much variance there was. A second thing that you will notice is that there's some correlation between size and managerial quality, right? And that's almost like mechanical and not surprising either. You know, if you have more people to manage, just by virtue of needing to manage more people, you're going to need to develop more sophisticated practices. It's easier to manage 10 people than it is to manage 1,000. And so you see that there's a mechanical relationship between size and managerial quality. And that's kind of not that interesting. But what is interesting to us And where we get all our empirical traction for all the analyses that we do is to see the variance within type and within size of police force, right? So you will find that there's a bunch of rural, teeny tiny police departments that are actually surprisingly well managed. And so if you look at kind of I'm going to see if I can get a clicker real quick. If you look at the figure of the very left, where you look at kind of the rural organizations, what you'll see is that the highest rated organizations there are at the same level as kind of the average state level police forces, which are really large police organizations, right? And when you look at the bottom level of the state police organizations that again are quite large, there's a bunch of state level police organizations that are shockingly poorly managed. And it's from that kind of variance within type and within size of police organization that we get traction for understanding what does a better versus a worse police organization look like. Conditional on the context that you're in and the size of organization that you are and that you need to be. And so what we did with all these data is we kind of followed two parallel processes that ended up converging almost perfectly, which gave us a lot of, I guess, confidence in the data and in the approach. We followed a kind of more of a theory base from all our qualitative data model of like, well, what does an advanced versus an intermediate versus a basic level of managerial development look like for police forces? And then we also followed a quantitative approach of like, let's just look at the data and how the data cluster and how the data distribute. And so we just ran clustering analyses of the different police forces, and they ended up clustering almost identically as our theory led process of categorizing basic versus intermediate versus advanced police forces. And there's a question about how do we measure management quality? And so, all right, so Wes, two things. Hi, Wes, it's good to see you. Well, good to see you in the chat. So what makes this instrument different and I think useful is that it starts from, it's an open-ended interview with open-ended questions. It's semi-structured. Which is a big difference with, for example, in the United States, there's this thing called dilemmas, which seeks to measure police quality, but the questions are closed-ended. And the second you ask them, it's very clear what the quote unquote right answer is, right? And so they'll ask you something like, do you measure the performance of your police officers in a tangible way? Everybody knows that the right answer should be yes, right? And so it's been demonstrated that when you ask questions that way for a management instrument, there's just a lot of misrepresentation. What's different about the World Management Survey is that these are open-ended questions where I don't ask you, do you do this? I ask you, how does your organization think about, performance for police officers? And then once you start answering that, I ask you a bunch of follow-up questions to see like, well, do you measure it in any way? Or how do you measure it? And how do you evaluate it? And then how do you reward police officers, or how do you sanction them if they perform poorly? And so because it's open-ended, people describe what they do, not really knowing what the right answer is, or you're not signaling what the right answer is. And it's been shown that this instrument allows you to collect kind of much more reliable data. What's tricky is that you need people who are conducting this interview who really know what they're doing. Because what happens is you're recording all the answers so that you can codify them later. But as people are answering, the interviewers kind of have a scale to grade the quality of the practice that is being described from 1 to 3, and there's kind of 0.5 increments, where 3 would be like, this is a structured, replicable, systematized practice that is kind of, repeatable all the time. And that's kind of the highest grade for each of the practices. 0 is like, there's no practice, like they don't even do it or they don't think about it, right? And so, and there's all the ranges in between. And so as you're conducting this interview, the interviewers who are very well trained have to be grading the police forces on each of these practices. And so you end up with a grade for each of the 21 for the first wave. For the second wave, we have I think it's like 40 something, because we included all the citizen engagement practices. So you end up with a unified score for like a unitary score for each of the practices. Then you also have an average score for each of the dimensions. And so going back to this, if we have these 6 dimensions, each police organization is going to end up with a score on each of the sub-practices and then each of the dimensions. And then you can aggregate the score to get a kind of an average score for the whole thing. What you see in this graph is the scores on each of the 5 dimensions, right? Operations, performance monitoring, target setting, talent management, and resilience. And again, what we found is that there was a very clear clustering of police organization across these 3 levels, where there was a set of police organizations that were very clearly kind of very basic in what they did across all dimensions. Some ended up in the middle, and some ended up with pretty advanced practices. And so what this allows us to do, and again, I'm not going to go into these data in much depth at this moment, unless you want me to come back to them later on. What this allows us to do is to do 2 things. Number one, we end up with this model of like kind of almost like archetypes of police organization, where I can tell you in general, what does a basic police organization versus an intermediate versus an advanced one look like? And then we can start thinking about what is a trajectory of reform that seems to make sense. Interesting things that we found is, not surprisingly, there's a lot of part of the reason why the scores cluster at these quote unquote stable levels is that there's a lot of complementarity across practices, meaning it's actually really hard to improve only in one dimension if you're not investing in all the other things that support it. To give you a somewhat intuitive and probably easy to follow example, you have seen it in almost all cities. Police chiefs love cameras, right? They love having cameras and traffic lights and across the city. They love how they look and they love having them, right? This is a relatively advanced practice. And you may want to invest in cameras because you think that gives you eyes in the whole city. But if you want that practice to actually work well, it turns out first you need a set of eyes that are going to be looking at the data that are going to be streaming through those cameras that know how to make sense of those data. It's a wealth of data. It's an infinite amount of data. You need a way of like capturing those data, processing, systematizing it, analyzing them so that you can then somehow translate that to an operational insight that you can do something with. Otherwise, it's just an ocean of data that you can very easily get lost in. So that means like now you're thinking, now we have 2 additional practices that I need for just the cameras to do anything. But you also need a loop that takes that analysis and insight into the operational side, and that can translate that into an operational mandate. And by the way, you need somebody to have the ability to tell people to follow those data that you got from the cameras, and to then evaluate their performance and follow up on their performance so that you know that they actually are doing what you're supposed to be doing. And those people need to have the incentives to actually do that instead of other things that they're being evaluated on, right? And so if you think about this, I just described one practice that you see, which are the cameras. Turns out you need 4 or 5 additional complementary organizational practices around other dimensions that also need to be fairly advanced for that one practice to work. And that is true across all practices, right? And so that's why you have these clustering that you tend to be either basic on everything or intermediate on everything or advanced on everything. And the question is like, how do I make these jumps from one to the next? And what we have found is that, performance management, performance monitoring and talent management are probably the most reliable practices to help you pull everything else. We can come back to that if you want. Whereas where police officers tend to go instinctively, which is like, let's just have more operational stuff, that usually doesn't pull other practices along. Rather, you can make a ton of investments there without really changing the organization in an integrated way. And again, I'm just giving you a lot of kind of an introduction to everything so that you can tell me what you want to come back to later on. But the basic conclusions that we got from all this research is, and the biggest point we want to make is management really matters. Management matters for policing, and of course, it matters for all kind of public organizations. And what we're trying to do here is document what good versus bad management actually looks like to help police chiefs and mayors who are trying to reform police organizations understand what it means to improve management inside of their organizations. As I was mentioning, there's some negative versus positive complementarities. For example, a positive complementarity is giving police officers a career path and a trajectory and some reliability on how they will get promoted in their career. A negative externality would be if you're rewarding police officers for arrests only, or for the crime rates in their area, and that's what you're rewarding them on. That creates all kinds of negative externalities for the rest of the organization, for example. And so we're working on this model of a coherent shift across these different levels of organizational development for police organizations. Complementing this, we've collected a ton of data on leadership and the style of the police chiefs, which we have seen matters a lot. And the last thing that I'll say about this is part of what our research seeks to do is help police organizations move away from the idea of best practices. We always think about, let's copy best practices. Because of the complementarity issue that I was describing earlier, trying to copy best practices from other places usually doesn't work, because you observe a practice, but you do not observe all the other internal things that also need to be in place for that one practice to function. And so instead of thinking about best practices, what we need to do is understand where we are today in our organizational development, and then think about how do we adopt better practices given where we are. And that's kind of where we're going with all of this research. So that's one big stream of research. I'm going to skip this. Then let me tell you a little bit about the other stuff that I have about 15 minutes left, I guess, on the timeline that I set for myself. Some of the other streams that we've been doing, which are more about this kind of citizen engagement and trust building component. The biggest initiative that we've done here is around questions of procedural justice. And let me tell you why. As you know, not just in Mexico and Latin America, in the US as well, there is a crisis that has reached like truly problematic levels in the legitimacy and trust of police organizations. And there's a crisis of trust. And without trust, police organizations just cannot do their jobs, right? If citizens don't trust the police, they're not going to report crimes. They're not going to be willing to testify or be witnesses to any kind of prosecution. They're not going to give the police information about what's happening in their neighborhoods. And so police are literally going to go in blind. They're actually going to be much more, they're not going to be supportive of the work that police forces need to do in order to help build public safety. So trust is kind of a precondition for police effectiveness. And having a crisis of trust can be kind of almost like a death sentence for the police organization's ability to fulfill their mandate. Now, there's been a wealth of research over decades over, what determines trust in institutions. And, the biggest component is kind of legitimacy, right? A perception of legitimacy of an institution leads people to trust it. And there's also been decades of research on what explains whether there's a perception of legitimacy of an institution. And there's kind of two big components there. One is, do I perceive that the institution is achieving the results for which it was created? And that's a big component of legitimacy. But it turns out that especially in policing, results matter, but actually what matters much more is not just the perception of results, but the perception of the means that the police use to achieve those results. And that's where procedural justice really matters, right? And so there's, again, there's a wealth of research, mostly led by Tom Tyler and colleagues, that has unpacked that, what allows people to feel like the means through which an institution achieves its results is legitimate are kind of four principles of procedural justice, meaning like I evaluate the process through which a decision was made or the process through which an action was taken. And if that process follows four principles in general, then it's much more likely that people will perceive that process as legitimate. And as a result, regardless of whether they agree with the outcome, they're much more likely to trust that institution. And these four principles that have been unpacked again through years and years of research is, people want to be given voice and they want to perceive that the institution is giving voice to the individuals that it's interacting with. One way to think about this is like the police should always hear every side of the story before making a choice, right? Or making a decision. So that's one principle, a key principle. The second principle is neutrality. The choices should not be made based on appearance or sociodemographic characteristics or preferences or anything. Like the principle is that regardless of who the person is, anybody in that same situation should be treated equally, and the decision should be the same, and it shouldn't be driven by any characteristics of the individual. A third principle is respect. You can be neutral and disrespectful, right? You can be kind of an equal opportunity asshole, if you want to think about it that way. And so respect and neutrality are complementary, and everybody wants to see the police treating every citizen with dignity and respect. And the fourth is a question of kind of trustworthiness or reliability or transparency, meaning people want to understand why a particular choice was made and what are the steps that are going to follow that choice. And so if you're going to arrest someone, people want to understand why they're being arrested and what's going to happen after that. Or if you're being fined, people want to understand why exactly you decided that a fine was the appropriate measure here, and then what are the next steps that should follow. And so the explanation of the process and why certain choices were made, like, is an important component. Again, people have observed thousands and thousands of interactions and in different organizations, and these four principles have been established quite clearly as determining legitimacy. What hadn't been determined is whether we can actually change these, meaning there's been a lot of research looking at procedural justice as an independent variable, and there's just, enormous, it's a very robust set of findings that as an independent variable, procedural justice is quite a very good and reliable predictor of trust. But it hadn't been tested or almost hadn't been tested as a dependent variable, which was what we were trying to do. Like, can you actually manipulate procedural justice in any way? And so what we tried to do is see if we could train police officers within an existing police organization to integrate procedural justice into what they do and see if that has an effect. And so what we did is we designed this experiment with the Mexico City police force, which is a randomized control trial, training police officers in procedural justice. And then we try to evaluate whether the training works. And we evaluated along kind of three dimensions. What we thought about is, like, for a training to work, like, three things have to happen. People have to understand the training and have to understand the concepts. They have to actually internalize them, and meaning they have to change how they think about their work. You can understand that and not internalize it, and then there's no impact, right? But you can't internalize something you don't understand. And these two things are important, but critically, people need to actually change their behavior. And so we try to evaluate across these three things. Just briefly to walk you through the experiment that we ran. I don't know, again, I'm sorry about that. My keyboard seems to sometimes want to skip ahead. So this is a map of Mexico City. The Mexico City police is divided into 72 sectors. We took 60 of those 72 and randomly assigned 30 sectors to treatment and 30 very similar sectors to control. Within the treatment sectors and the control sectors, we randomly selected about 1,000 police officers from each of the treatment and control groups of sectors. And we ended up training about 900 police officers in procedural justice training. I can tell you more about how we designed it, et cetera. And then we followed the treated police officers and the control police officers over a period between 3 and 6 months, along the dimensions that I'm going to describe to you briefly. What I'm going to talk to you is just about the results, what we found. And again, I can come back and go deeper into any of the concepts as you see interesting. So regarding whether they understood the concepts and whether they changed how they thought about policing, we found large, significant, and reliable effects of the training. This is comparing treated officers versus control officers 3 to 6 months after the training. So we found that on all the components of procedural justice and all the instruments that we used to measure it, our treatment group was 0.3 to 0.4 standards deviation higher than the control group across all the principles. And so we found that the training had a significant and reliable effect, causal effect on how police officers were thinking about the importance of procedural justice. Interestingly, the training, and we measured this as secondary things. Interestingly, the training itself had additional positive outcomes, such as police officers increased their identification with their profession or with the institution because they got trained in procedural justice. And police officers increased their perception of citizens parentheses, police officers tend not to have a very high perception of citizens. And I'm sorry to disappoint you if that's a surprise. But, you know, in the experience of police officers, citizens routinely try to get away with things. They routinely lie. They routinely try to, you know, have the law apply to others, but not to them. And so police officers tend not to trust citizens. And in our measurements, trust in citizens by police officers actually increased as a result of the training, which was an interesting and unexpected secondary outcome. So this is in terms of perceptions. To see whether they had internalized the concepts, we followed a photo elicitation methodology, meaning what we did is we gave police officers a camera and we said, go out and take pictures of what it means to you to be a police officer. What does it mean to you to be a police officer in relationship to yourself, in relationship to your peers, and in relationship to your superiors? And so we sent them out for a week to take pictures, and then we brought them back, and then we sat down with them and we conducted semi-structured interviews for about 90 minutes, just to see how they talked about the pictures that they took and the stories that they told around them. We have about, I guess, close to 400 police officers in this, half in treatment, half in control. And again, summary is we actually did find significant effects across between treatment and control in how they think about the profession of policing. And the effects there's 38 groups that of course I'm not going to have time to walk you through, but we saw that they thought about the role as police officers different. They talked about what it means to be a professional very differently. And their view of citizens was systematically different between the treatment and the control groups, who at baseline, or when we started, looked very similar on all these things, right? And so we saw these significant shifts in how they think about their profession. And I'd be happy to talk about more if you're interested. And finally, to measure whether their behavior changed, this was the toughest thing to carry out, but it was also the most interesting and the most fun to me, is we designed a mystery shopper instrument where police officers were responding to a call for service, but when they arrived, they didn't know that they were interacting with two professional actors who were enacting a standardized script. And so, you know, police officers reacted the way they did, and we filmed and we recorded all of this, and then we codified very carefully all these interactions to see whether there were any systematic differences between the treated group and the control group in how they handled the citizen situations. It's about almost 600 interactions, about half and half treatment and control. And the summary is, the way it works is we have, for each interaction, we have 3, let's say, quote unquote, members of the audience, right? We have 2 professional actors who are, quote unquote, an accuser and an accused within an interaction, and they're interacting with a police officer. The accuser and the accused, the professional actors, don't know what the study is about. And of course, they don't know that whether they're interacting with a treatment or a control police officer. So their perceptions of the interaction are actually quite interesting and quite valid. And so we collected, after each interaction, we collected the perceptions of what happened from the 2 actors. But then we have a trained coder who is also blind to the condition of the police officers with their treatment and control, who's coding all the interactions. And so we have these 3 perceptions of procedural justice of what happened. And summary of what we found is kind of very much in support of what we found here. They were very clear and just like very clear, significant and causal effects of the training, also on the behavior of the police officers, as measured by these 3 ways, in these 3 ways. So I'm actually going to stop here. I have a couple of other initiatives that I could tell you about. I'll give you kind of a 1-minute summary of some of the other stuff that we've been doing. From these 2 streams of research that I just described on organizational development and procedural justice, we developed a model that we call a model for integral citizen security. And we've been experimenting, basically it's a model that has a combination of procedural justice, community policing, meaning sending police officers to have information sessions with citizens, and then translate that into kind of operational strategies, etc. And so we've ran some RCTs implementing that model in 4 cities in Mexico. But these are the 3 where we did it more kind of larger interventions, and we had a 4th one where we did a smaller pilot. And so we've done that. And then the last thing that I'll mention very quickly, and again, I'm happy to go back to any of this if you're interested, is we've also implemented a pilot of focused deterrence of violence, or gang violence reduction in Mexico City, together with the Mexico City Police. And I'd be happy to tell you more about that. But basically, this is an intervention that is designed to help disrupt or break up gang violence spirals that are frequent across cities in the US and in Mexico. And this is the one intervention that has been shown to reliably reduce gang violence in the United States. And we've been working with the Mexico City government to run a rigorous pilot of this methodology in the Mexican context. And I'd also be happy to go into more depth into that. So I'm going to stop here as promised. I've been talking for close to 45 minutes. And this hopefully gives you an idea for the type of research that we've been doing and the types of findings that we've been getting. And I'd be very happy to go into anything that's on your mind, and happy to take this conversation wherever the audience might find more interesting. I've been talking a lot, and so I would love to hear some thoughts from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. That was wonderful. We really appreciate your thoughts. I think what we will do, if it's okay with Lourdes and everyone else, is to open the floor for questions. And